All right. All right, guys. So, a little weird to be teaching in an empty classroom, but hope everybody's safe. Hope everyone's good at home, and just going to continue to go through some of the most important times in world history, talking about the rise of fascism and World War II. We ended last class talking about the Great Depression and how it affects world governments. And first of all, kind of the key overarching theme in understanding this is that when there are terrible economic times, there are changes in government. There are changes to try and meet the needs of the state, of the people. We see in the United States that the Great Depression is going to change the United States far to the left. We see one of the more liberal government systems that we've seen when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, is elected. He passes a series of laws called the New Deal, which we'll talk about, which is a very, very liberal set of laws that are directly there and intentioned to give money directly back to the people. But on the other side of things, we see a drastic shift to the right in places like Italy, in Germany, in Spain, and that coincides with what we call the rise of fascism, which is one of the direct causes of World War II. So when we look at the Great Depression, we have to label that as a very big and important cause of World War II because we have these economic hardships taking place. Now, we talked about the Great Depression last week, but if you don't remember, our situation is quite dire on both sides, either formerly the allies of World War I or the Central Powers of World War I. We're going to see lots of economic problems. In the 1920s, which of course is directly after World War I, Western Europe is slowly recovering. They're slowly recovering from the millions of people that were killed in their country and the economic hardships, with the exception, of course, of Germany. Germany, as we remember, were hit with really four things as part of that Treaty of Versailles that weakened Germany economically. The first is the stripping of their colonies, in which they could have gotten some money and natural resources from. The second is the reparations, billions of dollars in reparations that were enforced upon the Germans. Not allowed to have a standing army. And then the fourth is that war guilt clause, having to take the blame for the war. The U.S. in the 1920s is the strongest economy in the world. Remember, the U.S. stayed out of World War I until relatively late. Also traded with both sides in the beginning. And because of this, the United States in the 1920s enjoyed the lion's share of the world's wealth. We're talking about 40% of the world's wealth, while only having 6% of the world's population. But that wealth in the United States was built on some pretty shaky grounds. One of the factors was that the U.S. farmers, now that the war is over, are overproducing crops. The U.S. had this huge demand for crops all throughout Europe because all of these people are not farming, they're fighting. And because of this, the U.S. was able to send large amounts of crops, especially wheat and corn, to both sides, but especially the Allies. And then, once the war ends, we have this huge overproduction of crops, but not enough people to sell it to. The demand has gone down, and therefore the price has gone down. And so the American farmer is first to get hit in the Great Depression. And when this occurs, then because farmers, who are about 40% of the population at this stage, don't have any purchasing power, they're not buying from small businesses. Now small businesses don't have enough money. They're starting to feel the pull a little bit. They're not purchasing consumer goods, and then the whole thing starts to spiral into a collapse. Also, we see Americans buying goods on credit. This is the first widespread era of credit, and the biggest thing that Americans are buying credit on, besides cars, is stock. And that, of course, lies the problem when our stock market crashes on October 29th, 1929. We talked about this a lot last class, but just as a reminder, it is characterized by huge amounts of selling of stock, especially started by bank failures in Europe. International investors got out of the U.S. stock market. Then we saw a panic that ensued as many American investors sold their stock. We lost billions in money through the stock trade, but it's so much worse than that because it is going to collapse the banks in the United States. Businesses are going to collapse, but banks fail as well. And again, that's because if everyone borrows money from the bank to be able to invest in the stock market, and then the stock market collapses, well, people then have no money to pay back to the bank. The bank, therefore, is going to collapse. And in the 1920s, before Franklin Delano Roosevelt with the New Deal, we didn't have any insurance of banks. Savings accounts weren't insured, and therefore, people that even weren't invested in the stock market lost millions, lost it all, so to speak. And so because of this, we are in a Great Depression, and especially marked by a drop in GDP, gross domestic product, as well as unemployment, massive unemployment. World unemployment, somewhere around 30%. In the United States, it's 25%, which is the highest unemployment in our nation's history. We also see that world trade is going to drop as a result, which we'll talk about in just a second. The places that are hit the hardest, Germany, especially because of inflation in Germany and bank failures and all the reparations they have to pay, right, all these things. The places where the colonies of our European powers are, Africa, Asia, Latin America, they're suffering because they're dependent on European goods, especially European manufactured goods. And Japan hit very hard as well, an exporting country, an industrialized country after the Meiji Restoration. Of course, what often happens during depressions is that governments are going to put up tariffs. Tariffs, as we know, are taxes on imported goods. And the thought process on this is that if we are able to put up a tariff, that the people of our country will buy domestic. They will buy within the country. If you're in the United States puts up a tariff that's saying, okay, we don't want American buyers to be buying from overseas. We don't want you to buy from China. We don't want you to buy from France. We want you to buy American. And so you put up these high tariffs. But of course, when that happens, what you are doing as a country is you are protecting your own businesses at the expense of other countries' businesses. And other countries then are going to put up retaliatory tariffs. They're going to put up tariffs as well. As a result, we essentially have every country, every major trading country in the world putting up high tariffs. And when that happens, we see that we have no trade. We have no world trade as a result. If you look at the map here, the graph, 1929, 1930, 1931, 32, and 33. We see a dramatic decrease in trade with tariffs raised all over the world. And that means the depression only gets worse. So how then do we react in different countries to the Great Depression? In the United States, the answer is a British economist is going to propose an idea that promotes deficit spending. This is something that we ought to know. It can be a little tricky for students, although it's not that difficult in practice. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist, he's going to promote in times of a depression that you want more money in people's pockets, and you also wanting the government to act as an agent of social welfare. You want the government to be able to spend money to help the people. And so, for instance, that's kind of a tricky thing for students. How can the government spend money to help people? One way to do this is just to directly give money to the people. Those are called dole payments, and they're done in a couple of ways. For instance, the government can give money to the states to divvy up money to the people that way. Or other ways that you could do this is the government spends money to create jobs for the people. For instance, let's say that the federal government decides that we need better roads, better highways throughout the country. We need a bridge over this river. This is a situation where we need infrastructure created. Therefore, the federal government could create an agency to build these roads, this highway, this bridge. And to do that, we need jobs. And therefore, the federal government is creating a bureaucracy that needs to be worked by people. That's creating jobs, as well as hiring people to go out and build these roads, build these bridges, etc. One example of this in the United States would be something called the Works Progress Administration or the Civilian Conservation Corps. Many different bureaucracies are created by the federal government for the purpose of giving people jobs during the Great Depression. Now that is spending money to help the people, spending money to give people jobs. Now, of course, where does the federal government get its money? It gets its money through taxes. But the other kind of interesting thing about what John Maynard Keynes is saying, he's also saying that during a depression, a government should cut taxes, meaning not tax the people as much. So essentially what he's saying is that we need to cut taxes, therefore people have more money in their pockets and more likely to spend on the economy. but we're also going to spend a lot more money. So if you're cutting taxes and spending a lot more money, the direct effect of this is that, in fact, you are going into debt as a government. That is what deficit spending is. That's the actual definition, is that you are spending more money than you're taking in. And so when we see our governments, such as the United States in the Great Depression, one way to fight this Great Depression is by intentionally going into debt, planned deficit spending, in order to help the civilians, the citizens of the country. Now, this is somewhat successful in the United States, and this is something called the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our American president, as we talked about last class, the president that has been elected the most times in American history is elected 4 different times. First in 1932, then 1936, then 1940, and then 1944. 4 different presidential elections he was victorious in. And he's a beloved American president, especially because of his foreign policy during World War II. However, he had his faults. Of course, the biggest fault being Japanese internment, which we'll talk about in our next lesson. But the other thing is that his domestic policies, the New Deal, were very popular, but it had its critics. So first of all, the New Deal, what is it? It's a string of laws, essentially. It's a string of different laws that are passed by Congress, that are signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And they really generally promote the 3 R's, which are relief, recovery, and reform. Relief is the idea, can we give direct money back to the people? Can we give money through dole payments to the people? Can we try to give money to the states to give to the people? People are suffering. They're living on the streets. They don't have enough to eat. Can we put money directly back in people's pockets? That's one. Second thing is recovery. Can we spend money to create jobs, as we talked about, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps, so many different bureaucracies created by the federal government to then give people jobs so that they are not unemployed. And then lastly, reform. Can we change the government to avoid future depressions? One such example of this was creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which allows people to have their savings accounts protected by the federal government. What that means is, if in fact banks failed in the future and you had money in the bank, that would be insured by the federal government. Therefore, you wouldn't lose it all if a bank failed. Now, that's just a common sense change. It's a common sense example of reform that the New Deal is going to address to avoid future depressions. So, all in all, the New Deal, in an overarching way, is trying to directly combat the Great Depression. As FDR said, we need to wage war on the Depression like you would an armed foe. And that's exactly what he does. Now, it works, and it makes him very popular in many ways, and it does provide hundreds of thousands of jobs for the American people. But really, to say that the New Deal directly solved the Great Depression would be inaccurate. Why it did decrease unemployment, while it did slowly bring about the return of the economy, we don't see an end of the Depression until we get to World War II. Once we get to World War II, everybody has a job. Everybody's working in the munition factories, or they're fighting overseas, and therefore, with that, that's really what ends the Great Depression, not the New Deal, although the New Deal helps, right? The New Deal helps. Okay, so that's how the United States responds to the Great Depression, the New Deal, FDR. We also see the Great Depression is going to affect Mexico in an interesting way. Mexico, as we last visited Mexico, has just gone through a revolution. They had a revolution of 1910. And we've talked about the unfortunate situations in Mexico in the 19th and 20th centuries. They're going from caudillo to caudillo, military dictator to military dictator. For instance, Porfirio Diaz was our last military dictator that had seized power in Mexico and was allowing the country to be taken over by foreign investors, including the United States. What I mean by taken over by foreign investors is that he encouraged foreign investors to come in and buy or invest in natural resources in Mexico. For instance, the United States invested in oil and controlled about 80% of Mexico's oil. And while this, was taxable by the Mexican government, a large amount of profits are going to Mexican energy companies, American energy companies or American oil industries. And so because of this, this is very unpopular, and Diaz became very unpopular with the Mexican people. And that's part of why there was a revolution in Mexico to try and figure out the economic crisis that's existing from all of the most important natural resources being controlled by foreign investors. And so because of this, we see a one-party system seize power. That's the International Revolutionary Party, or PRI. And PRI seizes power really directly after the Mexican Revolution. And they're going to control Mexican politics for really the entire 20th century, all of the 1900s. And one of the ways in which the International Revolutionary Party actually succeeds in combating the Great Depression in Mexico during this time period is that they nationalized Mexico's oil. And what that means is it was privately owned by other countries, and now it is nationalized. Now we own it as Mexico. We control it as Mexico. And this becomes a huge state-owned company. Mexico, the government actually owns this company, and they can employ people to come work in this company, and that's called Pemex. We still have our problems with PRI. It's still seen as corrupt, still accepting bribes from different businesses or crime leaders, but we'll revisit that after the Great Depression. All right, and then of course, the major change that occurs as a result of the Great Depression is the rise of fascism. Fascism, first of all, let's define it. So fascism is really very simply defined as extreme nationalism. That's the first part. It's a political system that is going to promote your country's interests above all other countries. And try to do this in a way that glorifies your country, that talks about the country's great battles and history. This man right here, Benito Mussolini, he is considered by many as the first fascist, the creator of fascism. And he would talk about how the Italian state, how Italy was once a great and powerful empire controlled by Caesar, and that they had conquered all of the known world, and it was their destiny to go out and assemble another great empire. And so this is appealing to the extreme nationalism of the Italian people, and it's also glorifying the military, and that's part of what fascism is too, glorifying the military and the armed struggle, and also, and we see this with a couple of groups, blaming minorities. In places like Italy, in places like Japan, we're blaming, especially, and it doesn't just have to be ethnic minorities, it could also be groups like communists. Communists, for instance, were criticized, or socialists were criticized in this time period for undermining the economic system. We see that Mussolini and Hitler both were extreme anti-communists. They viewed communism as a big threat to their states. Of course, Hitler also is going to add ethnic into these scapegoating of minorities, and of course we'll talk about that a lot. Where do these fascist governments arise? They arise in Italy, Germany, and Spain as well. And we'll talk about Spain in just a second, but we start with Italy. So fascism rises in Italy. Mussolini actually invented the term. This is a fasces, which is a Roman symbol for punishment. It's an axe with a bundle of sticks. And this was the symbol for kind of military force. And so he uses this as the symbol of fascism to glorify the Italian emerging military. And Italy, as you recall, is one of those states that was insulted by the Treaty of Versailles. You'll remember that Italy, Vittorio Orlando at the time was the prime minister of Italy, and he was at the Paris Peace Conference to try and negotiate favorable terms for Italy. And you remember that the Italians were denied fiume. They were not allowed to gain land from World War I. As a result, the Italians left that Paris Peace Conference very frustrated at Britain, at France, at the United States. And because of this, and Mussolini is going to criticize the Italian government. He's going to call them weak. He's going to say that we need to have a strong government that can go out and exert our strength on nations that do not respect us. And so that's part of what this idea of fascism is, glorifying the military, glorifying military strength. We also see another term that in Italy becomes associated with fascism, and it's called corporatism down here. And corporatism was a term that, again, coined by Mussolini, where all sectors of the economy work together. They were supposed to flow and work together seamlessly, and that was supposed to increase efficiency. What sectors is Mussolini talking about? He's talking about the businesses, he's talking about the unions, and he's talking about the government. They're all supposed to work together, communicate together. And this is nice in theory, but in practice, what this was the government telling unions what they could do, the government telling businesses what they could do. This was a government-controlled state, and in theory, it was supposed to be promoted as a very egalitarian way in which to run your country, but in practice, it was totalitarianism. And totalitarianism means all sectors of society are controlled by the government. Italy, and especially Mussolini, controls everything. Now, how did Mussolini come to control in Italy? Well, Italy is going to go through tough economic times, just like all of Western Europe in the 1920s, and then in the 1930s again with the Great Depression. And when we see this, we see that governments are often to blame for this. Governments are often blamed for the problem. In the United States, for instance, our president, right during the Great Depression, right as it sets out, is Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover loses so much popularity that he loses in a landslide to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who becomes our next American president. But things aren't so simple in Italy, because we have a monarchy in Italy at this stage. We have a king, King Victor Emmanuel, who's running the government. But at this stage, Mussolini is going to use the unpopularity of the government right now to come in and form a government to restore order. And so Mussolini is going to criticize the Italian government for weakness at the Paris Peace Conference. He promises relief from the hard economic times after World War I. He marches on Rome, presents himself to the king, says, I'm here to restore order. The king really has no choice but to say, okay, I'm going to allow you to run the government, rule the government. And Mussolini is going to start to do that. He's going to start to promote all of the kind of totalitarian things that you would see from a fascist state. He's going to promote lots of propaganda that glorifies himself as this great military leader, this great strong leader. Kids, indoctrination. We see indoctrination in the schools where kids are taught every day that they should look up to their wonderful leader, El Duce, the leader, Benito Mussolini. So this is only part of totalitarianism and propaganda that comes with it. And Italy has got an important role to play in the rise of Hitler in Germany. And the reason I say this is because a key part of Mussolini's fascism is glorifying military strength. And so he sees an opportunity to show that Italy has become this, or is becoming this great, powerful, strong military state, because there is one independent nation left in Africa at this stage, and you guys will know that that nation is Abyssinia, or Ethiopia. In fact, the Italians had attempted to conquer Abyssinia in Africa during the 1890s with the Scramble for Africa, and they were unsuccessful in doing so. Mussolini sees an opportunity then to seize Abyssinia, to show that Italy now has become this great, powerful, strong, militarized state. And so that's exactly what he does. Mussolini orders the invasion of Abyssinia, and by doing this, he's defied the League of Nations. You might remember, of course, that the League of Nations was created after World War I. It was created as a body of nations that was supposed to protect nations from being invaded. And if, in fact, a nation was invaded, they were supposed to come together and use arbitration or negotiation to get the invading nation, the aggressor nation, out of the invaded nation. This seems like an opportunity for which the League of Nations to come in and do something, and yet the League of Nations only imposes some weak economic sanctions on Italy, and Italy just drops out of the League of Nations, and that's that. So really what we have in a situation where the League of Nations is supposed to be keeping peace, the League of Nations has just played its hand, and it showed that it's very, very weak. And this is actually the second time that the League of Nations has showed that they're very weak. And people like Adolf Hitler are going to notice that the League of Nations are very weak, and are going to continue to defy the League of Nations over and over again. Okay, this is Benito Mussolini in Rome announcing that Abyssinia or Ethiopia has been conquered. All right, so let's talk about Germany now. And Germany, as we've talked about, is the nation that is hit the hardest with the post-war suffering and the Great Depression. And for Germany, it starts right after World War I. And unlike the other countries of Western Europe, Germany doesn't recover during the 1920s. Let's talk from the start. So Germany, after World War I, of course, they were led by Kaiser Wilhelm II. But Kaiser Wilhelm II was exiled out of the country. He became a very unpopular man because he, of course, glorified the military and militarism leading into World War I. And so what we see in Germany is the first ever democratic government. We see the Weimar Republic, and the Weimar Republic is an attempt to implement democracy in Germany for the first time. Now, this could have worked. The Weimar Republic could have been successful, democracy could have been successful there, but it was operating under a lot of handicaps, the Weimar Republic. For one, Germany had never been a democracy. This was an entirely new democratic system, a new governmental system. And for one, democracy takes time. It takes debate. And during the Great Depression and during this post-war suffering period, people aren't going to have a lot of patience. They want changes now. They want changes quickly. And they're going to find that people have many different ideas on how to get Germany out of their mess, how to get Germany out of their problem. And so people become very frustrated. Their government can't take action quickly enough. And they have good reason to be frustrated because they're going through the most inflation that we have ever seen in world history, a hyperinflation to its most massive amount. The Germans, of course, hit with those reparations, right? Billions of reparations that they need to pay as a part of the Treaty of Versailles. They also were stripped of their colonies, so they can't pay back those reparations. And so because of this, the German government forced to start just printing money. We're just going to print as much money as possible. And to do this, we know that that's going to create inflation, but perhaps we're going to be able to pay back some of these debts that we have. But by promoting all this inflation, the German mark, their currency, becomes worth essentially nothing. And the best way to talk about this is to talk about a loaf of bread. A loaf of bread in November of 1918 is worth 1 mark. It costs 1 mark to buy a loaf of bread. In 1923, it's 200 billion marks to buy a loaf of bread. Marks are essentially useless, and that's why you see pictures like this of kids literally playing with marks as building blocks, as toys. They've got stacks of money, and they can't afford a toy, but they can afford to play with these German marks, right? We also see as a result of frustration in Germany is that war guilt clause. That's the really, in some ways, the most damaging because it is it made the Germans take the blame for starting World War I. And this was a deep injury to the pride of the Germans, who of course didn't start World War I. This was a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. So it is on this platform that we see the rise of Adolf Hitler. In 1922, Hitler joins the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazis. And yet, in the 1920s, the German people are not yet so disillusioned that their new government, the Weimar Republic, can't work. They still are wanting to give the Weimar Republic a chance to work. And because of this, Hitler is going to preach out against the Weimar Republic, is going to attempt to organize a coup over the Weimar Republic, and he's going to be arrested. He's going to be thrown in jail. And at the time, he was considered a radical, a maniac, a psycho. A little bit of history of Hitler. He was born in Austria, and he served for Germany in World War I. He's German-speaking, and he served effectively in the war. And then when he got out of the war, he didn't have a job. He was unemployed. He actually became a painter for some time. And then he joined this National Socialist German Workers' Party, joined the Nazi Party, and he became famous for his speeches. He was a very gifted speaker, and because of this, he rose up in the Nazi Party very quickly. However, as I said, when he attempted the coup, the overthrow of the Weimar Republic in 1923, the German people called him a maniac. They said, this guy is not who we need right now. We need democracy. And so they throw him in jail. Now, in jail, he's going to write a book. This book is a very famous book, and it's called Mein Kampf. It means my struggle. And in Mein Kampf, he's going to write about 3 goals for Germany, to get Germany out of its current state, its economic terrible situation, and its loss of pride. And those 3 goals: 1, creation of a pure German nation of Aryans. He calls Aryans the German people, the destined people, with their blonde hair and their blue eyes. And he says that it's other people that are corrupting the gene pool in Germany that are the causes for Germany's problems. He's also going to unite all German-speaking people together. Germany lost land as a part of the Treaty of Versailles. They lost land that became Poland. They also lost land that became Czechoslovakia. Can this land be returned to Germany? Can we unite all German-speaking people? And then last but not least, Lebensraum, or living space. There must be living space for this master race of Germans to live in. Now, of course, this is radical psycho stuff that in the 1920s didn't get a lot of attention. But then in the 1930s, when the Great Depression hits and people are starving on the streets and they're living on the streets, this becomes more attractive to the German people because they're in such dire needs, and their government, the Weimar Republic, has not succeeded at all in solving the problem, the economic problem. And so this guy is promising quick fixes. And in a time of desperation, the Nazis start to gain more power, more and more power. But even as late as 1932, Hitler still isn't the most popular person in the country. In fact, in 1932, he's going to run for president, and he's going to be defeated by Paul von Hindenburg, who is 85 years old. This guy is very old, and yet he is actually defeats Hitler running for president. But while it was a defeat for Hitler, it was a win for the Nazi Party, because the Nazis were elected as the majority party in the German parliament. More Nazis were elected than any other political party, and by this stage, Hitler had become the most high-profile Nazi in the country, especially for his speeches out against the Treaty of Versailles that he would give out outside of town hall or out in the beer gardens, or he would speak about the loss of German pride and how he would be the one to return German pride. And because of this, we have a weird situation in which we have an 85-year-old president that's not a member of the majority party. And President von Hindenburg now, as kind of an olive branch, is going to appoint Hitler as his chancellor in 1933 to kind of allow him to operate government with him, the president. The Nazis then are going to say, we are in a situation now where we have a more moderate president and we have our guy, our radical, in the chancellor position. We need to find a way to get Hitler as the most powerful person in Germany. And so they are going to try and find a way to create a panic in Germany, to try and create a situation where the German people feel like they need someone that can get things done quickly. And so they are going to try and create an era of panic by burning their own parliament building, by burning the Reichstag, the German parliament building. They set it on fire. And then they give out these public announcements that Germany is under attack by communists, by extremists, and that they need to act decisively and quickly. And so with that now, in this era of emergency, Parliament that's being run by the Nazis is going to pass a law. Because of this state of emergency, we need our Chancellor, Adolf Hitler, to have unlimited powers. They passed the Enabling Act in 1933 that says Hitler now can pass laws without the consent of Parliament or the President. You've now given Hitler blank check powers, unlimited power. And what he's going to do is quickly strip the Weimar Republic of all of its power and operate as a dictator. He outlaws all other political parties. He suspends free speech, freedom of the press. And when President von Hindenburg dies just a year later, he now is the unquestioned dictator of Germany, right? And so now, at this stage, you can look at 1934 as the dictator of Germany. That really is the start of the Holocaust. Now, often when students think of the Holocaust, you think about the concentration camps and all of the terrible things that go on. Relating to the concentration camps and extermination, the final solution. But there really are four stages of the Holocaust. The four stages are the stripping of political and economic rights. That's the first one. The second one is segregation, segregating Jews and, as Hitler called them, other undesirables to other places, especially in ghettos, especially in Poland. And then the third one is concentration. And the fourth one is extermination. We are going to learn and talk about all of these steps in the Holocaust. They do not happen all right away. It is a systematic move through this extreme anti-Semitism by Adolf Hitler. Hitler, of course, becomes the dictator in 1934, and he is going to immediately, as he said he would in Mein Kampf, promote scientific racism and extreme anti-Semitism. Hitler is arguing, he argues through some twisted logic that there are some races that are genetically superior to others, and that the gene pool needs to be free of these genetically inferior peoples, whoever they are. And not just in Hitler's eyes were Jews genetically inferior, but it also included Africans, people of African descent. It also included people that had any sort of mental or physical illnesses. It also included people of the LGBTQ community, the Romani people, gypsies. I mean, there are many different people that Hitler said were not fit to be in the gene pool, that there need to be this master class of Aryans together, this pure German nation. And because of this, he's especially going to start to scapegoat the Jews, who had a very sizable population in Germany. And he is going to say that they are the problem for the nation's problems and that they need to be removed from the gene pool. Now, with this, he's going to start to use propaganda that are starting to label Jews as untrustworthy, as traitors of the state. And he's also, it's important to understand that the way that he's looking at this, he's not looking at Judaism as a religion. He's looking at Judaism as an ethnic nationality. He's looking at this as essentially saying that Jews you're Jewish if you have 3 Jewish grandparents. And that means that you're labeling in people that have never practiced Judaism, that weren't even raised Jewish, that were maybe Jewish and then converted to a different religion. You are essentially labeling one group as this enemy group, and Hitler does this, and then he is going to initiate the first element of the Holocaust with the Nuremberg Laws. The Nuremberg Laws are a successful attempt to strip all of the political and economic rights from Jewish people. A series of laws to disenfranchise and discriminate against Jews. And first of all, forbidding the marriage between Jews and Gentiles, which are non-Jews. And this is a way in which Hitler attempted to remove Jews from the gene pool. 2, stripping Jews of their citizenship. And 3, requiring Jews to wear a Star of David on their clothes. And what this did is it didn't allow Jews to vote. And more importantly, it starts to really segregate Jews in society. While we are not yet at the portion of the Holocaust where Jews are physically being segregated or separated to ghettos, they are being segregated as far as how they are viewed in society. They're being constantly viewed or pushed by the German government as the problem. They're constantly being pushed as these others, these undesirables. And now that they are having to wear these Star of Davids because they are no longer considered citizens, people start to stop associating with Jews. They stop talking to them. They start going to Jewish businesses. This has huge psychological effects and economic effects. No longer are people going to Jewish businesses. They start to struggle. They start to foreclose. I mean, this is really the start of very, very hard times in the Holocaust, and it's only going to continue to increase along Hitler's long reign as dictator. It's not going to last for another. It's going to last another 10 years. It's going to make it all the way until 1945. But it's interesting because in 1936, all this starts to kind of go on hold for a second. The Holocaust kind of starts to be put on hold, and the Nazis start to try to hide what they're doing. And the reason being is because in 1936, in the summer of 1936, Germany is hosting the first ever televised Olympics. This is a actual televised Olympics where the world is watching. And the Nazis know what they're doing is wrong, and they know what they're doing would be unpopular with the rest of the world. And so they attempt in many ways to hide or downplay what is being done to their Jewish population, to other marginalized populations, and instead use it as a massive propaganda event to promote themselves as the master Aryan race, the master German class. And with that, we see a very memorable 1936 Summer Olympic Games. If you're following along at home and you want to follow along with my PowerPoint, there's a very cool video on this, the first live broadcast of the Olympics. You can watch just about 5 minutes of it. It's good. You don't have to watch the whole video. But anyways, the Nazis, as I said, are going to temporarily stop its treatment of Jews while the world is watching. But they themselves, the Germans, are only going to allow Aryans to compete for Germany. And this is going to kind of provide some justice, because the Americans are going to, of course, allow all athletes to compete. And one such athlete is an African American by the name of Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens is an American hero. He is from Alabama. And first of all, in 1936, coming from Alabama and being an African American, this guy's already suffered discrimination and segregation and Jim Crow laws and all these terrible things going on in the South. And yet Jesse Owens is an upstanding young man. He comes to Berlin and he consistently talks about how wonderful it is to be there to represent his country. And yet he's being subjected to all of this racism from these extreme, racists, this Aryan master race, and yet he continues to represent his country very well. And then he goes out in the track and field events and dominates the other countries, including the German master race runners. He wins 4 gold medals, the 100, the 200, the 400 relay, and the long jump. And this guy is an absolute stud. And he is going to kind of show the world that there isn't a master race of Germans, that in fact that any athlete can win in the Olympic Games. Weirdly, the Germans are going to take and twist the Olympic Games. They're going to come out and put out a movie in 1938 called Olympia, where they actually take all of the events of the Olympic Games and then edit all of the events in which the Germans lost and take it out. They edit out all of the events in which the Germans lost and only post the German Aryans winning these events. And so it's actually used as a propaganda win for Germany. The next event that is going to bring about the second stage of the Holocaust is something called the Kristall Nacht, or the Kristall Night. This event was also called the Night of Broken Glass. It's going to be sparked by a Jewish young man, teenager in Paris. So that's in France, obviously, and the Germans had sent a diplomat to go and negotiate with France. And this diplomat was a Nazi. This diplomat was very anti-Semitic. And he was coming in and talking to the French government, and he was talking in a way that was very discriminatory towards Jews. And there was a fear by this young Jewish boy, 17, that there would be anti-Semitic policies passed in France as well. And because of this, we'll see that he's going to shoot this German diplomat. This 17-year-old boy shoots this German diplomat. And when that happens, Hitler and the Nazis are going to rationalize and try to justify amping up their anti-Semitism in Germany as a retort, as a excuse because of this 17-year-old boy killing this German diplomat. And with this, they're going to say we are under attack by the Jews. This is exactly what Jews do. This sort of thing. Nazi special forces, or the stormtroopers, are going to ransack Jewish homes and hospitals and schools. 1,000 synagogues are burned. Thousands of businesses. People are killed in the streets or dragged from their homes and taken to the ghettos or the concentration camps. At this time, many Jews are also told to leave the country. This marks the radical event that changes from the first stage of the Holocaust to the second stage of the Holocaust. The first stage is stripping of political and economic rights. The second stage is segregation. This stage is the stage where if you were a Jewish person and you were told to leave the country, that you were still allowed to leave the country. That will not be true for much longer. That's only going to be true for about about 12 more months. And then after that, there's no choice. And so this event is a very important event in the Holocaust and world history. We also see the Spanish Civil War. Now, the Spanish Civil War is somewhat inconsequential when it comes to World War II. The Spaniards actually stayed out of World War II, although they were an indirect ally of Germany and Italy, the fascist dictators. And it also kind of shows where we are as far as taking sides in this war, in World War II, I should say. So we're pre-World War II, obviously. It's 1936 to 1939. But we have a changing government in Spain. In fact, Spain is becoming more democratic. In 1931, the Spanish king is going to abdicate, meaning step down. And that is the last Spanish king that is controlling the government for, how long? Guys, we've been talking about Spain all throughout this course. We last visited the government of Spain back in 1492, right, with King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. Spain is still a monarchy at this stage, and yet Spain in this moment in 1931, with the king abdicating, we are seeing Spain becoming a democracy. We see the Spanish people are now electing a new liberal government called the Popular Front. And the Popular Front is going to try and help all people in Spain. We still see the Catholic Church dominating land ownership and wealth. We see the Spanish military, especially the high-ranking military officials controlling lots of land in Spain. And the Popular Front, this new Republican government, a republic, is trying to divide the land up amongst the people. And of course, this is going to be popular with peasants and workers and the lower class, but unpopular with the conservatives, like the Roman Catholic Church and the army officials. And so we have one man that's going to oppose this, and that man is General Francisco Franco. He is a fascist. He is going to assemble an army and try to put down this new democratically elected government, the Popular Front. So we see the Spanish Civil War break out. We see on one side the people, especially the middle and lower classes, the Popular Front. They're promising a more egalitarian society. And then we have this guy, Francisco Franco. He is a conservative leader. He gathers up an army, and he's going to try to come in and seize the power by force. So we see the nationalists, which are Franco's forces, and then the loyalists, the people that are loyal to the actual government of Spain. And why this war is significant is because the world is watching very, very closely. We have another example of a fascist dictator rising to power, Francisco Franco. And is this fascist dictator going to control another major country in Europe, or are the people going to succeed, or is democracy going to succeed? Now, Hitler and Mussolini are both going to arm the nationalists. They're going to help Francisco Franco. They see a potential ally, another fascist dictator. They're actually going to provide him arms and munitions, and as we'll see, also bomb a strategic target for them. Now, in this case, what does the U.S. do? Because obviously the United States would have a vested interest of protecting another democracy, and yet the U.S. actually doesn't do anything. The U.S., the USSR, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, volunteers come to fight for the loyalists, volunteers, average citizens, but the U.S. government and these governments don't actually give the same support that Hitler and Mussolini did to the nationalists. Now, why not? Why is that the case? The answer, guys, is really complex, and it has really to do with the American tradition of isolationism. The United States has often, throughout its early beginnings, been isolationist. They considered many things that happened in Europe to be completely out of their affairs. They did not want to get involved with things in Europe. And then we did. And then we got involved in World War I. And World War I, in the eyes of many Americans, was a war we shouldn't have entered. But if you think about the actual reasons why we entered the war, the Zimmerman telegram, right, this insult to the American people about promising Mexico to have some of Americans' land. The Lusitania, right, a ship that was shot down, 128 Americans on board. Economic ties, right, big economic ties to the Allies, all this money that we had loaned to the Allies. Many American people then said, well, okay, why did we go to that World War I? We probably went to that war mostly because we loaned all that money to the Allies. We had all of these all this money that the Allies owed us, And so therefore, we had a vested interest in the Allies winning the war. That's why we joined the Allies in World War I. So then the American people rationalized that if we start supporting the loyalists in the Spanish Civil War, then we're doing the same thing. If we start pouring money into Spain, we're going to have a vested interest in coming in and helping the Spaniards, and then that's going to bring us into the war as well. That was the fear, and because of this, even though FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president, wanted to actually support Spain, he didn't have the American people on his side. He didn't have Congress on his side. And therefore, the U.S. kind of had to stay out of this event. And when that happens, we see that the fascist dictator, Francisco Franco, and his nationalist forces are going to be successful. And one of the reasons why he's successful is because we see bombing conducted by the Germans and by the Italians. Germans and by the Italians, especially the Germans, are going to bomb the city of Guernica, which is a city in northern Spain. And it is one of the first inventions in which civilians were specifically targeted. And we see what we call the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, is going to bomb this city in northern Spain. And many historians believe that this was actually a training run for the Luftwaffe, that they were actually coming in to train for their new blitzkrieg tactics that they'll use in World War II. Regardless of the case, we see this bombing event in northern Spain, the Germans directly helping Francisco Franco. This is a very famous painting by Pablo Picasso. It's called Guernica, and it represents this terrible tragedy. It's actually huge. It's 11 feet tall and 25 feet wide. And one of the more famous paintings that Picasso did, and it immortalized the tragedy of the situation. The conclusion of this war is that Francisco Franco's forces are victorious. Franco himself serves as a dictator until 1975. And while Spain did not fight for the Axis powers, did not fight with Germany and Mussolini during the war, it did allow the Nazis especially to move troops through Spain, to conduct training exercises in Spain. So it was more or less an indirect ally of the Axis powers. And then our last slide for this lecture is the rise of conservatism in Brazil. Brazil is struggling with the Great Depression, as many countries are in the world in the 1930s. We see a new leader, Getúlio Vargas, who's going to seize power. And he is going to promise this by promising new industrial jobs, new manufacturing jobs. And he succeeds in providing these for the Brazilian people through his Estado Novo program. But his Estado Novo program, guys, is going to resemble many of the fascist dictator totalitarian programs in Europe. He's going to oppress free speech. He's going to promote nationalism. He's going to censor the press. He's not going to allow any political parties to exist against him. And even though Brazil actually sides with the Allies in World War II, it's very contradictory. And the Brazilian people point this out. And they say, why are we helping the democracies of the world in World War II, and yet we ourselves are being run by a fascist dictator? And because of this, this is going to seek Brazilians to have a change in government after World War II as a result. Okay, guys, that is our discussion of how the Great Depression affects governments in the 1930s. I am also going to do a lecture on the first half of World War II, the start of World War II, which I'll post today as well. So what I'd recommend that you do is just kind of follow along through the PowerPoints, kind of leaf through the PowerPoints as I do these. I do have some cool videos. I would recommend watching the video on Jesse Owens that I have on just on the PowerPoint, and click on the link. I also have some cool videos in my World War II lecture that I'll be doing today as well. So keep that in mind. Hope you enjoyed.